Now, as it turns out, the training facility in Hackensack was not in a very good area. In fact, one of her colleagues had been mugged walking down the alley to her car behind the building a few weeks before. And so she was a little nervous about doing this, but decided to put those fears aside and headed for Hackensack after her shift in Rochelle Park. The first night was smooth sailing. She made it to her car, drove home, and even started to make a mental list of all the gifts that she might be able to afford if she just worked a few more shifts. The second night, however, was entirely different. When she entered the alley, she noticed at the other end 2 men were standing in the shadows. This made her nervous, but she decided to keep her head down and avoid contact and make it to her car as quickly as she could, and hopefully the outcome would be the same as the night before. About halfway down the alley, she noticed that the other 2 men had entered it and were walking towards her very quickly. And for reasons that she couldn't explain, she felt certain that they were going to attack her. Panic swept over her. Her plan to avoid eye contact went right out the window. She became focused on their faces instinctively, trying to make out their shape and expression. And then when they were about 10 feet away, her full-throttle brain recognized something familiar. And before she had a moment to think, the words, "Hi, Frank," erupted from her lips. The 2 men stopped, dead in their tracks, startled by both the tone and content of her words. Now, Frank Passarella had been a pretty nice kid when he was younger. Mary Lou knew his mother, Jean. He had gone to school with her son, Stephen. But in high school, he developed a drug habit. And after graduation, without a job, he started to steal to support that habit. He'd been arrested several times and had gotten so bad that his parents had to put a deadbolt lock on their bedroom door so he wouldn't sell any more of their valuables. Now, Frank was stunned and embarrassed and managed to mutter the words, "Hi, Mrs. Donalo," and shuffled by with his would-be partner in crime. And Mary Lou made it to her car with her heart pounding in her chest. And she drove home, knowing for certain that if she had not recognized him, she would have been his latest victim. And it would not have been the happy holiday that she wanted for her kids. How do we know all of this? Well, in fact, Mary Lou Donalo is my mother-in-law. And for 22 years, I hear this story every year at Thanksgiving. Every year, the details are a little bit more vivid. Mary Lou has, "Have we told you about the story about Frank Passarella?" "Yes, I remember, Mary Lou." No, please tell us again." But what is it about this story that we can all relate to? Whether it's something that's happened to us or someone that we care about, what is it about our psychology that allows us to navigate through threatening situations like this with a moment's notice without having any time or information to deal with? Well, the answer to that question lies deep in our past. Because just like primitive humans did tens of thousands of years ago, Mary Lou had to make 2 kinds of decisions very quickly and very accurately with very little information. First, she needed to determine what were the intentions of those 2 men at the end of the alley. Were they friends or foes? Were they going to help her or hurt her, give something to her or take something from her? Or said another way, what degree of warmth could she pick up about their intentions? And then given what she thought their intentions would be, very quickly she'd need to determine what was their ability to carry out those intentions. Were they strong or weak, fast or slow, intelligent or foolish? Or what degree of competence did they have? And it turns out that for primitive humans, these were the most important decisions they made every day. Not only when they navigated through situations with strangers, but frankly, in their daily interactions with people in their family or in their tribe. Because in the original game of Survivor, if you got kicked out of the tribe, you didn't get to go to Redemption Island like they do on TV. More likely you were dead within a few weeks because we depend on each other so heavily for food, clothing, shelter, and protection. And so through evolution, humans became hardwired to make these decisions instinctively and instantly, almost subconsciously, based on all of our interactions with other people. And so, as it turns out, social psychologists working around the world in the last 10 years have determined that there is a universal model, a universal pattern and a process by which we form relationships and become loyal to other people, and that there's a predictable pattern of emotions, and that those perceptions, that lead to a predictable pattern of emotions, and it's those emotions that drive our behavior. And that they've been able to show that over 80% of human behavior is driven by this model. So let me explain how it works. First, there are warmth perceptions, and you should think of this as a category of things that we perceive. How honest do we perceive the other person to be? Trustworthy, Do they listen? Do they care about me? Do they have my best interests in mind, or are they only interested in what's good for them? And that's a long list that could be filled in that category. Competence would be all the things that you would expect. Intelligence, constructive ability to solve problems, creativity, reliability, strength, speed, intelligence, knowledge, all of those things would fall into competence. So think for a moment about someone you know who was very warm, very friendly, very approachable, who was also really skilled and capable and effective at what they do. Typically what this causes is for us to feel admiration and pride to be associated with this person. We're drawn to them, and it causes us to become loyal to them. On the flip side, if we think of someone with all that same skill and ability, who's cold and unapproachable and we're not sure whether we can trust them, this typically causes us to feel jealousy and envy and caution. We've got to be careful. They could pose a threat to us, but we're not sure we can trust them. And so the behavior that comes from that is kind of grudging cooperation. We've got to go along to get along. If we flip that around and we think of someone who's very warm and friendly and sociable, who's really not very good at anything and not very reliable, what this leads to is pity and sympathy that leads to neglect and indifference. And of course, the worst combination is if you're cold and incompetent. That's really bad, because we're going to have contempt and anger and reject you and avoid you. And so this pattern of perceptions, emotions, and behavior is driving all of our interactions every day. It happens almost subconsciously. We don't have to think about it. And we're constantly updating our perceptions and our attitudes towards people based on our interactions with them. So let me give you an illustration how this works. It's going to require a little bit of audience participation. So if we plot this into two quadrants, on the vertical is warmth, and on the horizontal is competence. And you can see the emotions and behaviors that come from each of those. If I were to ask you to think about Tiger Woods for a moment, how many of you would say that you think that Tiger Woods is very warm, friendly, honest, and trustworthy? Get your hands up. Not all of you at once. Not very many, right? Okay, we've got our baseline on Tiger. But now if I were to ask you the other question, how competent, capable, skilled, and effective? Do you think he is very competent, capable, skilled, and effective? Certainly many more. And so it won't surprise you that when we conduct national studies, this is exactly where Tiger Woods shows up. We see he's very competent, he's not very trustworthy. We kind of grudgingly cooperate and go along and tolerate him. Now, somebody else. What about Paula Abdul? She used to be a judge on American Idol, right? How many would say she's warm, friendly, honest, trustworthy, all of that? More than Tiger, at least, right? But how many of you would say that she's very competent, capable, skilled, and effective at what she did on American Idol? Not very many. And so this, of course, is where Paula Abdul shows up. And it's why she gets replaced, unlike Simon Cowell, right? It won't surprise you that someone like Oprah Winfrey, very competent, very warm, huge following, loyal fans, and unfortunately, even a $51 billion Olympics at the beach in Russia cannot make Vladimir Putin any more warm or competent, at least in the eyes of American adults. And so these are the perceptions that are guiding our emotions and behaviors every day. And what you may find more interesting is that it turns out these same perceptions, emotions, are driving our behavior towards companies and brands as well. How do we know this? Well, my colleague and co-author, Dr. Susan Fisk, is the world's leading authority on warmth and competence. And we've spent the last 3 years studying 45 companies and brands, evaluating how customers perceive them from a warmth and competence standpoint, and how loyal and how intent they are on purchasing from them. And so let me show you what we found. So if we look back at the same 4-quadrant chart, we were curious to know whether we would see a similar pattern. And so what we found is that in the upper right-hand quadrant, what you find is a lot of household, very respected brands, your Coca-Colas, your Johnson & Johnsons, your Hershey's, some very respected nonprofit organizations. At the other end of the spectrum, it may not surprise you to know that this is where we found large financial institutions, insurance companies, energy companies, and so on. All those companies that you hear so much about, the frustration and anger that people feel towards them. In the lower right-hand quadrant, we actually found luxury brands like Mercedes and Rolex and Rolls-Royce. And bear in mind, this is the total adult population. This is how they're perceived. I think people who are fans and owners of Rolex and Mercedes and so forth probably do not see them this way. But in the general population, they are seen as less approachable, less friendly for most people. And then we were not sure if we'd find anything in the upper left-hand quadrant, but what we found actually was government-subsidized brands and organizations like the Postal Service, Amtrak, Veterans Administration's hospitals that are viewed to be generally well-intended, but not competent enough to probably compete or continue to exist without that federal subsidy. And so we saw this same pattern of perceptions, emotions, and behavior towards companies and brands that we saw towards people. And while that's certainly very interesting and, it fills up the chart, but these are not companies in most cases that compete with one another. What was much more important and much more valuable is that when we rolled up all that data, what we found is that 50% of all of our purchase intent and loyalty towards companies and brands can be explained by very basic human warmth and competence perceptions. Warm, friendly, competent, capable. Before we start talking about price, quality, availability, endorsements, all the stuff that we spend so much of our time trying to communicate and differentiate on, 50% is driven by these basic human perceptions. And I don't know about you, but I've spent the last 25 years working in big companies like Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, my master's at Wharton, my PhD from the School of Hard Knocks. And it seems to me that every year there is some new theory about how the world works or doesn't work. And I often think, gosh, these are all really valuable. There's lots of good stuff in here. But how do they all fit together? How could they all be true? How do we make sense of it all? What are we supposed to do to try to make all of this happen? Well, I've become convinced that warmth and competence is the universal framework that connects all of these great ideas together. It's the underpinning psychology that drives our behavior and why these things work. And so why is it then that despite that we have more data than ever before, we have more ways to communicate with customers than ever before, we have more technology than ever before, and arguably more competence than ever before, why is it then there's an endless number of sources that says customer loyalty has never been lower? Never been lower. And the more I got into this, the more I became convinced, looking back on my career, probably 50% of everything I was taught and trained to do is either no longer true or may not have ever been true. Our focus on maximizing shareholder value, generating a measurable ROI on every marketing dollar as quickly as possible, relying on loyalty programs as a substitute for knowing who our customers are and building a relationship with them is not going to get it done anymore. This mass dehumanization of how we do business isn't working anymore. All the things that we were taught and relied on, it seems to have changed. And at that point, I became inspired and said, you know what? How could I have been so wrong? How could I have been so misguided in this? How could we have been wrong about all of this? And after I kind of got over that, I became obligated, compelled, inspired to share what I'd learned with others and help us navigate through this moving forward. So let me share a story with you that kind of brings this to life. In August of 2012, Teresa Cook lay lying in a hospital bed, dying of pancreatic cancer in Nashua, New Hampshire. By her side was her grandson, Brandon, 21 years old, wanting to do whatever he could to make her a little bit more comfortable in her last days on earth. One of the most devastating things about pancreatic cancer is that it wreaks havoc on your digestive system. It takes away your appetite, causes rapid weight loss, at exactly the time your body needs strength to fight the infection. So Brandon was trying to persuade his grandmother to eat something, but she wanted no part of the hospital food. She said it was awful. But when pressed, she did say, there is one thing. If you could get me my favorite food, I'd give that a try. A bowl of clam chowder in a bread bowl from Panera Bread. So Brandon said, no problem. I can take care of that, Grandma. I'd love to do this for you. On a Tuesday afternoon in August, he got on the phone and called up Panera Bread. I'd love to pick up an order of clam chowder to go. And there was silence on the phone. And then they said, I'm sorry, there's a problem. During the summer, we only make clam chowder on Fridays. Now, Brandon wasn't going to take no for an answer. He said, don't you understand? You need to make an exception. My grandmother may not be here on Friday. And so they put the manager on the phone. And Susan Fortier didn't miss a beat. She said, no problem. Come right over. We'll have it ready for you when you get here. And it was ready when he got there. And in addition, she'd put together a box of cookies for Brandon. And she said, here you are, no charge. You just let us know how your grandmother's doing. If you need more clam chowder, we'll be here for you. And so Teresa Cook had clam chowder on that Tuesday. again on Friday, and then the following Tuesday. And it wasn't until Saturday, August 18th, that Teresa Cook passed away quietly in the hospital with her family by her side. The clam chowder had sustained her for maybe another week. It was just a bowl of clam chowder. It was just another week. But for Brandon and his grandmother, it was a matter of life and death of a different kind, one that they'd never forget. And it turns out there are a lot of other people that we'll never forget either. Because on that first Tuesday, Brandon sent a thank you note over to the people at the Panera Bread store on Amherst Street in Nashville, New Hampshire. And he did that on his Facebook page. And what do you imagine happened next? Within a few days, over 800,000 people around the world had liked that post, nearly 35,000 comments. Many of them were from other Panera employees saying, "This is why I'm proud to work at Panera. We try to do things like this in our community whenever we can. This is why I'm taking my family to Panera for dinner tonight." And people assumed that it wasn't just Susan Fortier that was a nice person that had done this. They assumed that Panera Bread, the organization, that all Panera Bread stores did this as a matter of policy. And so what accounted for this remarkable outpouring of emotion and behavior? Was it the quality of the clam chowder, the location of the store, the speed of the service, or the price of that clam chowder? No, it wasn't any of those things. It was a genuine, empathetic act of warmth and compassion for another person. And wired we are through evolution, we are strongly wired to respond much more heavily to actions of warmth and demonstrations of warmth and competence because it was much more predictive of human survival than competence. And so that's what people were responding to. They didn't have to think about it. They heard it, they read it, they felt it, it moved them. The same way it does in our lives every day. And so what we can take away from this story and all the research that we've done is that in fact people were the first brands, faces, the first logos. And all the branded trade and commerce that we've been engaged in for the last several thousand years is just an adaptation of the way that we were wired by evolution to interact with one another. So we can say, in fact, every human is a brand. Every brand is human. Our brain processes them and makes decisions on them exactly the same way. And if you think about it, for most of human history, commerce between people was done face to face. The decisions we made were as much about the person that we were dealing with, what we knew about them and the relationship that we had with them, as it was the product or service involved. And while the tools and technologies that we use to make purchases today are very different, the thought process that guides us is exactly the same. It's on the basis of warmth and competence. So let's take an illustration. Let's go back in time before the Industrial Revolution. Take the cobbler, who for thousands of years would make shoes for other humans, not only by hand, but literally shaping them to the size of each of your feet. He knew his customers by name and face and right down to the tips of their toes. And the relationship the cobbler had with his customer was one of interdependence. That cobbler was as dependent on the customer as the customer was on the cobbler. They didn't have credit cards and direct deposit. People frequently had to pay with IOUs and barter. And so there was this strength of a relationship between them and balance in that relationship. Because if the merchant or cobbler did wrong by someone in town, pretty much everyone in town would know about it by Sunday church. And that merchant would come under pressure to make it right or damage his relationships with others in the town and threaten his livelihood. But what happened next? Next came the Industrial Revolution. Mass production, mass communication, mass distribution. The shoes are no longer made by hand, they're made in a factory. This is great. We've got tremendous efficiency, cost reduction, availability, transportation. A lot more variety is available. But this notion of a relationship between the customer and the cobbler became impractical. It became impossible. We had to fill the void with mass communication and other ways to communicate. Companies and brands became very large, and what used to be a very balanced relationship became very skewed in their favor. And the social accountability that used to exist in small towns went away. To where now, not only do we not only see the people that made the shoes or the people that sell them to us, we don't even see the shoes. We just order them online. They show up in a box from Zappos. If we don't like the size or it doesn't fit, we send back. But something's changing. After 150 years of what I would call the Middle Ages of marketing, e-commerce, social networks, and mobile devices are bringing us back to the future, back to an environment that looks a lot more like before the Industrial Revolution, a relationship renaissance where, again, we are making more of our decisions about products and services based on what we know about the people behind them than the product or service itself. And that's really what the story about Brandon and his grandmother is all about. For the first time in 150 years, the whole world is getting wired in the same way that we were wired by evolution to interact with one another. So when someone does something nice, not only everybody in town knows about it, everybody in the country knows about it by tomorrow. Or similarly, if someone does something rotten, we hear about it overnight. And that social accountability that companies that are large and had power are not accustomed to are being brought to their knees by that. So as we move forward, again, it's going to be warmth and competence that drives our behavior, steam-powered and enabled by technology. It's warmth and competence on steroids. So let me give you another story to illustrate how this works and how companies are able to use this and deliver this to their customers, reflecting on and building on these insights. It was August of 2006 where I first learned that Starbucks' tremendous success was probably not due to the quality of its coffee, the location of its stores, or the speed of its service. At the time, I was Senior Vice President of Marketing for Aramark Corporation, a U.S. company that is a $13 billion food service provider. It provides food services on college campuses, stadiums and arenas, hospitals, and so on. And Aramark was a licensee of Starbucks. We operated 75 Starbucks stores on college campuses around the country. The problem was that Aramark was not meeting Starbucks standards. We're not delivering the kind of customer experience that Starbucks demanded. And so Aramark was at risk to lose their license on these 75 stores, which would have been a huge problem. In a last-ditch effort to retain and restore the relationship, the folks at Starbucks invited a team of senior executives from Aramark to go out to their headquarters in Seattle and for 3 days be dipped in the whole process by which they delivered the experience that they did in their own stores. And so I was fortunate to be one of the group that went out to Seattle, and we spent time in their headquarters. And I expected to hear about how they chose their coffee beans and how they roasted them and how they designed their stores and how they chose the locations of them. And we certainly heard a lot of that. But what really struck us is very different from what we were doing at Aramark, was how they recruited, managed, and motivated hourly employees. And one of the things that they shared with was something they called the Little Green Apron Book, which, as the name suggests, was a little green book that would fit in the apron that a barista or associate would wear. And in that book, they talked about 5 ways of being, 5 things that they wanted employees to demonstrate not only to customers every day, but to each other every day. Welcoming, genuine, considerate, knowledgeable, involved. And in that little book, there were 5 cards, 1 card for each way of being. On the front was a little explanation as to what it was about, and on the back were blank lines. And every day, they were expected, whether it was colleague to colleague, colleague to customer, colleague to supervisor, or supervisor to colleague, catch each other doing these things right, recognizing and appreciating and thanking them. Whether it was picking up a shift, going the extra mile for a customer, saying something thoughtful to someone, going the extra mile in one direction or another in one of these 5 ways. And what impressed us is that this was not something that just sat on a shelf. This was an active part of how every store ran every day. And on the wall in the back room was an apron with a little one of those pockets there, and on the pocket was the name of every employee. And those little cards would get put into those pockets, and they would collect them and value them and remember them on a weekly basis. But it didn't stop there. They took those cards, and they were frequently sent back to headquarters as a way to capture stories about what happened in their stores, and use stories as a way to support, enable, and propagate the culture that these 5 ways of being represented, that they wanted to encourage and preserve, even as they grew to a very large company. And so they told us about a number of these stories, and one of them that really struck with us was about a store on the West Coast. This particular store had a regular customer named Pete. He was an elderly gentleman, came in several times a week, orders coffee a certain way, would sit in the corner, read the paper, and then head home. Everybody knew Pete, greeted him by name. And so this went on for a few years. And then, after a while, for about 2 weeks, Pete didn't come in. And people started to wonder, I wonder where Pete is. We haven't seen him in a while. I think he has a daughter in LA. He's probably on vacation visiting her. And then a few more weeks went by. Still no Pete, but one day a young woman came in. She said, does anybody here know a customer named Pete? And everybody said, sure, we know Pete. Where's he been? Has he been on vacation? She said, no, I'm sorry, Pete is my dad. He had a heart attack a few weeks ago, and I'm sorry to say he passed away. I'm in town to put his affairs in order and go through his apartment. And while I was doing that, I found something I couldn't understand. There were these 2 big bags. And inside those bags were empty Starbucks cups. It said things like, "Have a nice day," "Come back soon," "Hope you feel better." And apparently my dad couldn't bear to throw these away. These meant enough to him that he held on to them. And he never told me about that, but apparently these meant a lot to my dad, and I just wanted to come and thank you for the obvious impact that you've had on his life. Not everybody's going to be like Pete. Not every customer is going to save their Starbucks cup. But it was very clear that it wasn't the quality of the coffee, the loyalty program, the location of the store, or the speed of the service that caused Pete to be loyal. It was these little, cost-free gestures of warmth and goodwill towards another person. It showed that we know you, we care about you, we have your best interest in mind, and we look forward to seeing you again. That is how we are wired to respond. It's warmth, competence, and compassion for other people. So whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, every day we are being judged on the basis of our warmth and competence. And the question you should be asking yourself is not whether you, your company, or your brand is adequately warm or competent, but rather whether you're perceived that way. Because despite the tremendous gift we are all given to accurately perceive the perceptions or the intentions and abilities of others, we are equally cursed with an inability to see how we are coming across to them. It's like we have blinders on. And this is what leads us astray in business in many cases. Let me give you one more story to illustrate. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, many companies went into survival mode, laying off employees and slashing spending in every way that they could to survive. One such company was a supplier of industrial products to the healthcare industry. And like other companies, they laid off employees, they slashed spending, but they went several steps further. They increased the size of sales rep territories, reduced service levels, raised the price on a couple of products, and even canceled several unprofitable customer contracts. And so as a result, despite that their revenue went down by 25% in 2009, their profits only went down by about 15%. Now, as you can imagine, this being a public company, Wall Street was elated with this, held them up as a model of cost management and discipline and preserving shareholder value. Their stock price hit nearly a pre-recession high while their competitors languished. Unfortunately, the adulation was short-lived. By early 2010, the company's sales had started to decline even further. A new CEO was brought in to try to set a new course for the company. And one of the first things he noticed and couldn't get a good answer to is that in addition to the reduction in spending that they saw from the recession, over the prior 3 years, they had lost $1 billion in customer accounts to their competitors. And no one could explain to him why. And so our firm, being a bit of a specialist in this area, got the call to come in and hopefully get to the bottom of it and help them chart a new course through it. And so we came in and we sat down with the management team, and they were all completely vexed over this. They were all working harder than ever. They couldn't get the results to go in the right direction. And they had tremendous pride in the fact that they were a leader in their industry. They had a reputation for integrity and long relationships with their employees. And so we set about contacting customers that had recently been won, lost, retained, and unsuccessfully bid, as well as the account managers that handled them, and asked them their perceptions of this company from a warmth, competence, and loyalty standpoint, and what had happened and why, in their view. Well, it became quickly clear that not only did this company have a major customer retention problem, they also had a major employee engagement problem. And there's no simple way or nice way to put it other than to say the feedback we got on this company was brutal. When we asked what happened, customers said things like, "I'd done business with this company for decades, and they abandoned us in our time of greatest need. They raised prices, they canceled contracts, they failed to honor their commitments, they sent new sales rep, they reduced our service levels." And we understand that times are tough and companies have to do some things, but these guys went too far. From the employees, we heard things like employees have been with a company for 10 or 20 years were let go by telephone to get them off the payroll as quickly as possible. And so not only was it the case that, as much as they wanted to believe that it was just business, it was nothing personal, exactly the opposite was true. One customer, the best they could muster about this company was to say they had recently selected them for their supplier. The best they could say, despite recently hiring this company, was that they do okay for a faceless monolith. That's what they had become. a faceless monolith. And in their effort to preserve a few more dollars on the bottom line, to preserve that shareholder value, to go the extra several steps behind cutting costs and laying off some employees, all it had cost them was thousands of customer relationships, hundreds of loyal employees, $1 billion in accounts, and a reputation that had taken decades to build. Because the sad message and sad finding of our research for the management team was that they were no longer the most respected and trusted company in their industry. They were actually dead last. And their initial reaction was, you've got to be wrong. You've got to go do some more interviews. You've got to do some more analysis, which we actually did. And each time we came back, the finding was more and more refutable. And it begs the question, how could this happen? How could they have been so wrong? How could they have been so blind to the message they were sending to their customers and the employees? They were just doing what Wall Street expected of them. They were doing what other companies were doing. It was the way they did it, the intentions that they were displaying. They were sending the message they really only cared about themselves, and they didn't care about the best interests of their customers and employees. It was a huge blind spot. And that's what's happened in our business. There are a lot of things that we did for decades that large companies, because they had the power and the relationship, could get away with. It's not that world anymore. One company or one customer has a bad experience or one employee has a bad experience, and everybody in the country will know about it the next day. So if you are interested in building a cult brand and having fanatically loyal customers, I could boil it down for you to 3 imperatives. First and foremost, we've got to become more self-aware of how our policies, practices, and procedures are coming across to our customers and employees from a warmth and competence standpoint. A lot of the stuff that we were trained and taught and has worked for 50 years is no longer cutting it. We have no place to hide. There's an expectation of transparency and honorability and integrity that is greater than ever before. And frankly, there's no such thing as a secret anymore. Every day, we're finding out the truth about the intentions and abilities of the management teams at large companies. Once we've got that awareness, we've got to be willing to make significant changes to the way that we do business, to align our policies, practices, and processes with the expectations that customers have from a warmth and competence standpoint. The sad finding is that in all the companies we evaluated, nearly all of them were perceived to be more competent than warm, and almost all of them fell short of customer expectations on warmth. And it's based on our mentality of maximizing shareholder value and generating ROI. And too often, it happens at their expense. And that's really at the root of the issue, frankly, is we've got to take a look at our priorities. Because if we became excessively focused on maximizing shareholder value, the reality is that in the eyes of customers and employees, that is not an aspiration that is worthy of very much loyalty, particularly when it happens at their expense. Now, of course, shareholders have to have a return, but we've got to have those priorities in balance with the interest of our customers and employees, or it's not going to be sustainable. So let me give you one more story about a company that did just this. When the recession hit in 2008, Domino's Pizza was already in trouble. They had 2 consecutive years of negative same-store sales. And so when the recession hit, things got really hard for Domino's and their franchisees. And it caused them to have some heart-to-heart, tough discussions internally and with their customers. They sat down in focus groups and asked customers what they thought. And they heard things like, "Your pizza tastes like cardboard. It's totally devoid of flavor." But even worse, those people at Domino's do not really care about their customers. And they had fallen behind, not only because of competition from Pizza Hut and Papa John's, but other frozen pizza as well. And so they dedicated themselves for the next 2 years, not so much to laying off employees and cutting costs, but rather to committing themselves to developing a whole new product, a new pizza recipe that would be better liked, but even more so how they were going to change their way of doing business so they would not again become so out of touch with their customers and their needs and perceptions. And so it was at that point, thinking about, well, we can't just come out and say we've got a new and improved pizza. How are we going to regain the trust of our customers? That Domino's is inspired to do something totally unthinkable from a business standpoint, but totally natural from a human standpoint. During the playoffs in 2009 for the NFL, they went on the air and their CEO basically started to apologize for the poor quality of their pizza, the poor quality of their service, and promised that they had learned the hard lesson and asking customers to give them another chance. It was unscripted. It was filmed by a documentary crew. They brought the executive chefs out from behind the curtain and put a human face on this company and demonstrated humility and transparency and vulnerability and ask Americans to give them another chance. And in fact, Americans and Canadians as well did give them another chance, because in 2010, Domino's achieved the highest same-store sales growth ever in the fast food industry, and over the next 3 years, continued to lead their industry in growth. And it was by putting their customers and their employees and their franchisees first. And all that came out of that for shareholders in the last 3 years was a 300% increase in their share price. By putting customers and employees first, shareholders ended up much better off than putting shareholders first in the short term. And so, hopefully the moral of these stories is clear. In a world where our reputation and our brand can be made or lost with a click of a mouse in a single day, our ability to demonstrate warmth and competence to others is perhaps our greatest asset. And it only makes sense that in any human endeavor, whether personal, professional, or commercial, our success has always depended on the loyalty and cooperation of other people. And so by putting the best interests of others ahead of our own in the short term, it doesn't require us to recklessly disregard our own interests. Rather, it's just an enlightened form of self-interest. And so I challenge you, don't let your company become a faceless monolith. Put a human face on it. Get out in front. Demonstrate warmth. Do not follow the traditional practices. Challenge conventional wisdom. I'm confident there is a remarkable human brand in each of you, your companies, and your brands. You just need to let it out. By doing so, you can change the world. Thanks very much.